Well, good afternoon, everyone. How are you today, tonight, this morning, depending on where you're at in the world? Thank you for joining us today for the part 3 in the annual Training Concepts webinar. Part 3 is about late base to peak performance. As always, let's see. My name is Tim Cusick. I'm the TrainingPeaks WKO product leader, and I will be guiding you through today's webinar. One of the things I really encourage you to do is ask questions as we go. In these Zoom controls, you have a little control bar like this down here. Please use the Q&A button. I will not monitor chat as I won't see it as we go. So please use the Q&A button. I can tell you today, I'm really hoping for some great questions. Just as we're still letting some people join and before we proceed, just a reminder, everything in these webinars are my opinion. I do try to base them on science and my own coaching experience, but in the same reality, my goal is not to tell you to coach like me. My goal is to help give some insights and thinking and examples of how I structure things and encourage you to go out and build your process and how you structure things. I have a caveat to today's session, and it's why I was talking about questions. I do have a question screen over here. So as you post questions, you might see me looking here. I'm looking at your questions. My caveat today is I always struggle with a webinar that gets into this amount of precision. So the reason I broke the annual planning down into 3 sections is when we're talking about the first part 1, the big picture, that's pretty easy and can be delivered based on kind of knowledge and physiology and science. We move on to part 2 and we really kind of get over the, hey, let's just get riding and build a little aerobic engine work. And we start building in more specificity into the training process, right? It gets a little bit harder. But when we get into this final phase of training, this really is the art of coaching. And every time I try to do a webinar where I take this phase and I try to explain it as just a process, it gets really hard. So just know that I'm not going to drill down to like, here's a secret workout, here's a secret do this, because that doesn't really exist. It's kind of an art and science thing. And I really believe in this final phase, it's more about the art, the coach or the coach athlete or the self-coached athlete's wisdom and experience and how they bring these things to bear. So I'm going to take a little bit more of like a rules-based approach to the process to walk people through it. That being said, please feel free to ask as many questions as you like. Some I might push off to the end so people can leave if they want. If not, I'll try to answer them as I go. Quick drink and we'll roll. Okay, now. So as I stated, today is part 3 of the ongoing series, Build to Peak. And this is the idea of building speed and power, right? Quick little summary of the presentation so far. I always start off with this same slide. It really is understanding that elite athletic performance is an integration of muscular, cardiovascular, and other factors. In the end of the day, other neurological factors, sorry. In the end of the day, we're trying to build velocity and power. One of the things that I am not going to stop saying throughout all of 2021 and all my educational programs, because I'm trying to point out something that's getting lost. It's not just about improving a metric or pointing an arrow up on a chart. It's about ensuring that the things we're working on and learning together and software and analytics and all this stuff are translating to our athletes in the form of velocity, power. They're winning more races. They're achieving their event goals and stuff like that. The thing is, when we look at such performance, it's pretty complicated. There's all the elements of, or physiological determinants of performance. And the reality is that's a lot of stuff to manage. And when we're trying to manage all of these things, there's this element you could call the butterfly effect. That one little thing can make things go really wrong, maybe really right, but one small change can induce a bunch of other changes. So when we look at a full season and we begin to think about annualized planning, we're using the idea of periodization to help reduce the chance of errors, which a more positive way to say that would be to increase the odds of success. And periodization simply breaks down the training year into some manageable cycles, a macro, a meso, and a micro cycles, all of which we're familiar with. And I went over very deeply in session 1 of this 3-part series. The idea of periodization is based on the general adaptation syndrome principle, which means you basically have a certain amount of work, build, then you rest a little and get stronger. Then you have a certain amount of work, build, and you rest a little and get stronger. And that's the idea of 3 phases. You have an alarm phase where your body goes through an alarm because you've introduced new stimuli. You have a resistance phase where your body works back against that stimuli and therefore gets stronger, it adapts. And then you have an exhaustion phase, a lot of ways to look at that phase, where you stagnate or decline. So you need to ring the alarm, raise the resistance, rest so you don't stagnate, and then ring the alarm again, raise the resistance higher, then rest so you don't stagnate or exhaust. There are numerous forms of periodization: linear, reverse, undulating, others. Again, I went on into pretty good depth of that in the first session. But just know that there's a lot of different ways to tackle periodization. And one thing too, just to be clear, there is no proof that actual periodization works in a scientific methodology. There's a lot of anecdotal proof, and I believe periodization works because it allows us to break things down into those manageable, digestible chunks. It allows us to set better step-by-step micro goals and address strengths and weaknesses in a kind of more compartmentalized way. But the problem is, periodization really is only a system of organization. And like training load as a whole, it's a neutral construct. It's just a way of organizing things. It isn't really the answer. It's not a training process or modality. It simply is a calendar, right? A fancy way. Well, I won't even call it a fancy way of calendar. It's an organizational way of organizing things. And the reality is this time-bound concept simply takes it, have a macro cycle, we have a mesocycle, so we might break down the season or the year, whatever terminology you want to use, into some general cycles. And then we have a bunch of microcycles, this specificity that happens in here. And this is kind of what you usually see, some schedule like this, right, where we chunk things in time. One of the things I really went in pretty good depth in cycle 1 or in presentation 1 here, and I'll say it again now, I am not a firm believer in progression by time. I think time is, again, it's a neutral concept here. You have some estimates of time of how long you want to work through certain phases and progress. But I think that needs to be based on more than just, oh, my 12 weeks is up, or oh, my 8 weeks is up. Now you need a certain amount of that because the whole idea here is to peak the athlete at a certain time in their big event. You want this peak to occur right at the right time. But I think we need to be more flexible and not as rigid. Watch part 1. Now, what is a process? And this is my process. And I put together some X's and O's, right? Some squares and arrows. And PowerPoint design probably isn't my strong suit, but I think this explains it pretty well. When we look at the process of annual training, right, it all starts with a diagnosis. And that diagnosis is based on ability of the rider, demand of the event. We then manipulate volume and intensity via a specific training modality while we manage fitness and freshness, all leading to the desired outcome of peak performance. So this is the basis of my process. For me, I have kind of 2 phases in my periodization. I simply have a training phase, which in typical language is a base and build sort of packed together. And then I just have what I call the performance phase, which is kind of build and peak, depending on how you look at it. And I'll go over that a little more deeply here in a minute. Now, what I started with in webinar 1 was my base, my early base period. Oops, sorry, I got ahead a couple of slides. Let me explain my process. So the diagnosis is we simply are looking at the ability of the rider and the demands of the event. We then and this is probably the main item we do as coaching, we're manipulating this volume and intensity relationship. I posted this slide recently because I've had people push back on this point based on webinar 1 and 2, but I still stand by what this is. As a coach, when we think about you're writing a training plan, right? You're typing away, you're building workouts. This is what you're doing. You're manipulating the volume and intensity relationship in a planned series of exercise or a planned series of stimuli events with the desire of achieving a certain outcome. But the reality is, in that manipulation, volume and intensity play separate, all but related, but separate roles, right? Volume is the quantity of work you've done, whether that's low intensity volume or high intensity volume. I'm just talking about volume. It's the quantity of work performed, and it really determines how much you adapt. I am a firm believer in the fact that if you want to make significant upticks in performance, one of the core elements you should consider for most average cyclists is a significant uptick in volume. You simply will adapt better, more deeply, right? So let's say you're an athlete who most of their life is trained 10 to 12 hours a week. You have, if you're saying, wow, I want to make that next significant jump, volume is a driver. And it's one of the things that can really get you to the next level. But you have to make a significant jump in volume, 20, 25%, if you want to expect a big step up in return. Now, if you're a professional rider that's been riding for 10 to 15 years, you might not have much volume room left, right? But that is the reality of it. It is what it is. But when we start talking about intensity, that is the quality of work performed specifically. And if you think about it, that absolutely does define the adaptation. So as a coach, you want a lot of adaptation, a lot of positive adaptation, hopefully very little bad, right? But you also need specificity in that adaptation. And the reality is the intensity manipulation is the way you achieve that. And I think that's really, really important. I was reading a great article, an interview with Dr. Andy Coggan the other day, part 2 of a series. And the interviewer, after all these years asked him, you've been training with power now for 25 years, or what are your key learnings? And he basically said, the same as when I first started, I made a list of the top 10 things I learned. Number 1 was specificity. Number 2 was specificity. Number 3 was specificity. And that really is true about power and how we implement. When we think about planning, I'm not sure we use that thinking well enough as why we implement intensity. I often see self-coached athletes and coaches, and this is just my opinion, and I don't mean it negatively, using intensity as a desire to create general adaptation, big adaptation. I want to make, why are we doing all those intervals? Because I really want you to make the big jump. The reality is volume will drive how much you adapt. Quality of the work specifically performed will drive those or define them. Via, training modality, there's plenty of different training modalities out there in the world, and there's a lot of discussion on training modalities right now. I'm about to do a pretty good podcast, hopefully, with shed some additional light on this, but whether you're talking about polarized or pyramid or threshold or undulating, there's plenty of them out there. The reality is once you have decided how you're going to manipulate volume and intensity, you need to think about the modality. How are you going to deliver, in what system are you going to deliver that manipulation in? You are managing fitness and freshness through all training. There's plenty of self-coached and great coaches I see here on the webinar today who absolutely know this is part of the secret to success, that training rhythm, keeping the athlete fresh enough to train hard when they need to train hard, keeping enough load or fatigue in there, right? So that they're adapting and responding. And the performance management approach, I think, does very well for that. The ideas of chronic training load and acute training load are so important to understand that is a measurement of the training load, not necessarily a measurement of your fitness. There might be correlation, but it is just a measurement of your training load. Adapting those principles in understanding how to manage training load helps. And finally, of course, we want peak performance out of the athlete at the right time. And what does peak mean? Just their maximum best, right? They can nail it. They're confident, they're ready, they deliver. So as we've gotten into these webinars, I've used this format to try to explain each step in kind of that visual summary process. Again, it's so funny when you have to explain your process, it really makes your brain work on overload to do it. When I talked about early base, diagnosis still driving the boat, ability of the rider, demand of the event. Early phase to me, early base is just significant volume increase. You always need a little bit of intensity and you should be maintaining. Watch that part 1 webinar. But during this phase, I'm looking for aggressive volume-based ramp rate. So training load, right? Chronic training load, acute training load are my drivers. That's my core focus of manipulation early base. My training modality, I'm using high volume, low intensity training in early base, 3 to 5 week cycles. Initially, performance declines, meaning somebody comes off the couch for a month and they start doing a fair amount of increasing volume at a reasonably brisk rate. Their performance will decline for the first 3 to 5 weeks because fatigue comes first and fitness follows later. As they go through that early base and they begin to progress towards mid to late base, and remember in that first webinar and in the second webinar, and then soon I'm going to show you, I have transitional activities I'm looking for. I want the athlete to achieve something from a performance sense, and that's where I will use like physiological metrics and stuff to make a good determination of when to move on. But once it's time to get out of that early base phase, the athlete's building the aerobic engine, they're establishing what I'm looking for, we move to mid to late base. Here's where we begin to introduce some intensity, mainly in the intensive aerobic approach or sweet spot training or tempo training, but we're working in between zones now. If you want to use the physiological elements that I showed you in part 1 and 2, we're working between LT1 and LT2 more frequently here as we're building up intensive aerobic conditioning. We're preparing somewhat for the demands of racing. And we're also using that work to accumulate training stress score and continue to build our efforts. My modality shifts from a high volume, low intensity training into a pyramidal approach, of which I described deeply in session 2. I shorten my training cycles now to make sure that I'm dealing with fatigue well. One of the things I hate in training cycles is the fact that it says weeks, right? The problem is like when you explain something and you have to put it in nice little boxes like a week, it's not always a clean little week. That could be 2.5 weeks with 0.5 of a week of rest, right? So just take it as a generalization. And as we begin to increase ATL, this leads to an inconsistency in mid-performance. I often see athletes, we want to believe fitness growth and testing and everything like that. It's nice and linear, right? Everybody gets stronger every time they go out on their bike. But I think the coaches here are experienced enough to tell you it's kind of more like this, right? It's a little and up and down. In this phase and in my peak phase, ATL really drives that inconsistency. So what happens now is the athlete's building some fitness, so they're more ATL dependent on performance. If they're a little fresher, they tend to perform a little bit better. If they're deep in an ATL, they tend to perform a little worse, lesser. So you see those variations. So now as we move towards peak, right, here is the new one. So far everything's been kind of summary. Now let's move forward into late base to peak, which I'm going to lump together. So let's start with this diagram for late base to peak. We actually have a new focus on the diagnosis. I'm going to go over that in a slide or two. It's not a new focus. It's the time to make some final decisions about your diagnosis. Manipulation shifts here. And to me, right, so if you think about our earlier periods, we've really just been training to train, meaning everything we've been doing is attempting to develop the physiological system in a generally linear fashion so that when it comes time for this phase, right, we're going to drive towards peak, we can do more peak training. So if somebody asks me, like, what am I trying to do through my base and build periods? I want the athlete to be able to do more work in the peaking phase than they would without it, than they would with a mediocre base, with a mediocre foundation. Because once we flip this switch, right, into peak training, it's actually a very short window of time, much shorter, in my opinion, than people think, even though I'm seeing people adapt to this mentality more and more. And once you get into this phase of flipping the, hey, it's time to start peaking switch, the more work you can do in that window, the higher the peak's going to be. It really is that simple, particularly if you built your foundation correctly, because I do believe the physiological process of periodization is linear, meaning one system builds on top of another system, builds on top of another system. And the more you get that right, the better. Now, I kind of, since I've already done 2 webinars, I have to jump right into the peak on top of that. Go back and watch 1 and 2 if you haven't, and that'll give you the background of that. But as we move into peak, right, progression of intensity, progression. And it's like, I even tried to use colors here. We get way more focused on intensity, but that doesn't mean we do more absolute intensity. It depends will be the answer. Generally, if you actually look at time as a measurement of intensity, like how many minutes a week are you at high intensity, it actually gets lower than the mid phase. It actually gets lower than here, right? Because you're out doing 2 times 20, 3 times 20, 90 minutes of tempo, things like that. Once we get into this phase and we flip this switch, you might be doing 25 to 30 minutes of VO2 max work. You might be doing 10 to 18 minutes of anaerobic or anaerobic capacity work, you might call it, right? So the intensity gets harder, not necessarily longer. And I think, and here's a good place to take notes or ask questions for later, the lost art here, not the lost art, the lost opportunity. I see people have gotten very good at progressing training load in these mid phases. 2 times 15 becomes, 2 times 20 becomes 3 times 15 becomes 3 times 20. So we've understood in this building phase that we should keep progressing time in zones, time in those targets. The same reality here is true, if not more important. And this is where, to me, and again, remember, this is my opinion, and I'll gladly discuss it anytime because there's better coaches than me and smarter people. I only know what I know. But what I observe as a mistake is when you get into this phase, volume decreases. You should always decrease volume so that you're leaving the athlete fresh enough for quality work. I'll get into that more deeply in a moment. But you need to progress the progression. You need to be more aggressive about your progression of intensity in this phase than you were about your progression of intensive aerobic work, of sweet spot, of tempo in the previous phase. All the cards are on the table right now. The athlete is peaking, and you got to push that athlete to the limit without breaking them. And that's why it's so important that you push that progression, which I'll talk about more deeply. At the same point, you're decreasing the overall volume. The mistake I see made all the time is people don't push the progression and they actually increase or maintain the volume, because what does your athlete do to you? I don't want to slow down. I don't want to ride less, coach. Riding less means I'm weaker or I'm going to get slower, right? And we have to convince them. It's a hard job. I've been there. I actually had that conversation today, as a matter of fact. So we need to accomplish those things. Training modality, that evolves to me. I moved to a polarized system, and here's where I think the idea of polarized training has real strengths. Now, I'll customize by some event types, but polarized is at the core of the rhythm. I go to 2 to 3 week cycles here. I leave that, but I talk about quality managed cycles, and I'll get into how and the measurements of that. But I'm measuring every workout the athlete. I'm more attentive to the individual workout in this phase than any other phase, because you're gambling, right? You're pushing all the chips. You've increased your odds, like I was talking about in session 1. You're pushing all the chips on the table now, and you're playing. So you need to look at every workout, and you need to have a lot of flexibility. You have a training strategy. It has a certain amount of intensity in it. You're manipulating that relationship. You're using polarized as a rhythm, but you got to be able to tweak and ebb and flow with your athlete's feelings and the level of fatigue. Because you're pushing everything on the table, you can push them over the edge pretty quickly. Got to be smart here. And again, they're going to be hypersensitive, exactly what I'm saying about measuring fatigue, to their ATL. This is my little progression chart. We're looking somewhere in here. I just kind of summarized that, so I'm not going to go over everything, but you can use this chart. I'll share this presentation with the recorded video. So now I always have this line, and I like to talk about it, the SDT, self-determined training. And the self-determined training edit here is what I want the athlete to add. Like if I'm having a really good day, what do I add? Right. And in earlier sessions, I might be saying, you add some time and zone, right? But in these areas here, I want them to go harder, meaning if they have a prescription of 7 intervals and they get through 1 or 2 and they're like, dude, I am killing it today. And I know I could do 2 more intervals. I don't want them to do 2 more intervals, because if you think about why, they'll screw up the future progression. They'll over fatigue, they'll do more work, and then I'll end up having to rest them, and I won't be at the maximum progression. What I want them to do is go harder. Now's the time. If they got a couple more watts in them, go more watts. And that's why it's important that you talk to your athlete about that as a strategy and let them know that your power numbers, they're the target. They're a generalization, not the absolute prescription. Unless they are. You might say, I only want my athlete going 300 to 310 watts. That's cool. I get that. But the reality is, for me, that's one of the things I'm preaching with the athletes in this phase. So let's dig into these phases a little bit, because I'm not going to get into this workout by workout. We're going to talk about some rules and process. I think if you as a group think about rules and process and what drives your thinking through these phases, you'll actually develop your system and workouts a little better. So let's talk about this idea of ability of the rider demands of the event. I went into this in cycle 1, and I gave this little analogy of, wow, what we needed to do was a generalized approach. And the idea was, we had this base training evolution. We started out just getting the chassis and the car and the engine ready. But in early base, we're really building that extensive aerobic work. We're making the chassis as big as we can. So we're preparing for a scenario where later in base, we can make the engine bigger and the car can sustain it. So that's just one of the ways to look at it. There's lots of different analysis or analogies you would use. As you move into this peak decision, specificity becomes so important. You need to make absolute decisions, not just on, also here we have a little more flexibility, right? We can deal with size. But once we get into the peak period, you just simply have to lock the athlete into a decision. What kind of car do they want to be? And sorry to stay on the car analogy, it just worked because I had it in the previous ones, right? Exactly what kind of car they want to be. And then you got to totally focus this peak phase on making that type of car fast. So maybe another way to think about it, if you take the progression of needs throughout an annual plan, from beginning of the plan towards end of the plan, you progress. I start with general weaknesses of the athlete, and that's anything they're weak at, right? We all have strengths and weaknesses. Everybody here knows what that means. As we move towards early to late base, I focus on limiters. A limiter is a weakness that can stop you from winning. So a limiter is a weakness that can stop you from winning. So I coach a pretty good female time trialist. She's been a good road racer. Has won a lot of good road races and stage races and stuff like that all around the world. The reality is she's never going to win a sprint finish, never. So whereas it's a weakness, it's not a limiter, in the sense that if she ever came down to us, we could spend a lot of time working on our sprint and we'll never overcome that reality. So, okay, that's a weakness. We do some work on it here because we want to keep the physiological. We don't want it to become such a weakness that it's a barrier to her overall training. But as we move here to limiters, we're really looking at the weaknesses that can stop her from winning. As we move into later phase, we start talking about general demands of the event and specific demands of the event. And you as the coach, for athletes with big A events, are particularly driven by this. Like they have one big event. They want to be national champion or Olympics or world champion or state champ or whatever that is. But that's even true for somebody who wants to race all summer long in the local, category racing series. The reality is, if they want the whole series, you might always be a little more the general demands of the event, right? I want to win the crit series. Well, okay, you can figure out what those demands would be and implement training that helps prepare them for it. But if they want to win the national crit championship, well, that might be specific. The course might be this, right? There might be a small hill on it. There might be a point where the separation could or will occur. So that reality is you have to get more specific. So it's like if you took, and I actually have this chart, I built this chart for myself like 5 years ago, and I kind of maintain it every year, even though I don't, it's not taped to my wall when I use it. It's probably in my head, but when I think about it a lot, I'll look at it just to refer to. And I just think general, specific, focused with each one of my types. And my specific will be blank. So let's say I took on a new road race athlete who's like, I want to be a road race. I want to win the state championships, right? There's some general demands. I have more in mind. I'm just giving you guys some general thinking. And then I also have specific. What if that state championships had a 4-minute power climb on it? It's been on the same course the last 3 years, and that 4-minute power climb has been where it always, comes apart, or the winner makes the move, or whatever it is. You got to find those specific demands. Then I have the kind of focused training. And to me, what I mean by focused training are what are the little things that you're both mentally and physically focusing on that you really need to do right in the race. Like a race like this might mean you really got to be good at pace maintenance, and positioning might be a better term, right? You got to stay in, in the group, you got to hold on, even if it's really hard, stuff like that. I'm not going to go over each one of these, but I think you get the point. And be really clear. This is an oversimplification. For any athlete who's ever seen one of my needs analysis, I go pretty deep one time at the beginning. I want to understand it well and do it with the athlete. So understand, I'm just giving you some ways to think about this. The next specificity becomes, to me, one of the crucial points of the toggle switch. Remember, so the reality is we're coming through base, we're coming through late base, whatever you want to call it. And then bam, we're about to hit the peak push, the drive for peak, right? To me, this is the time, and it's funny, we've been talking about this in the Facebook group a little bit, and somebody linked a couple of very key podcasts that do a great job of going over this and explaining the idea here. When you move into the peak period with your athlete, you have to make an analysis, a series of decisions of where they're at, and what I call the capacity versus power equation. If you think about a lot of my other webinars, there's oftentimes I'll say, you've got these decisions to make, cost benefit, right? Capacity and power. I've gone over this pretty heavily in some other webinars, like interval webinars and stuff like this. But the reality is, as you come out of base, you've been building, you've been working, hopefully things are working the way you're at. But I find that athletes come out somewhere with a balance of capacity and power. And I do this thinking as a quadrant analysis. I don't have a fancy chart. I have a square on a piece of paper. And it's like, wow, the athlete has high power but low capacity. Or they have low power and low capacity, bad training. They have high power and high capacity. Well, that's a good spot, but maybe we've gotten there too quickly. And low power, low capacity. So what does that mean? Low capacity means I've built the physiological engine well, and the system is good. So I was talking to an athlete this morning who's been recovering from a longer-term injury, and she's back in with her team, and team camps are happening, and she's struggling a little bit. She's not as fast as the team because her training's been very disrupted with some surgery and other stuff. So I asked her, she said she got dropped on a climb. She's not someone who usually would get dropped on a climb. And I asked her, so what was going wrong? What couldn't you do? She's like, well, and my heart rate wasn't high. I could breathe fine. But yeah, somebody's pointing out the typo. This should say low power, high capacity. Sorry about that. You got to have one. It's not fun if I don't have one good typo. So this should say low power, high capacity. So back to the message, capacity. She's like, I wasn't breathing that heavy. My heart rate wasn't through the roof. My fuel energy felt good. I just could not access the power. You know what? She was right on. She was right on in her explanation, because that's exactly what was going. Because we've been forced into some very controlled training, because she hasn't been able to go hard, blah, 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 whatever. You know what I'm going to do, just because so many people are pointing out, I hope this will work. Let's just fix it. Sweet, that worked. All right, so her capacity is big because the injury limitation has allowed her to just build a bigger and bigger aerobic engine. Her cardiovascular capacity is massive right now. Her aerobic fitness in a metabolic, her aerobic capacity is huge. She's burning a ton of fats as fuel. She's all wired that way. But when the smackdown comes, she can't go really hard at this moment. So she has big capacity and low power. So that capacity really is wasted, maybe. Depends what we do next, right? But the reality is you need both capacity and power when you move in this phase. You as the coach or the self-coached athlete, you have to determine where the athlete is at this point. You have to determine where the athlete is at this point. If they're like, wow, and this is where you use power data versus power duration metrics. You can learn a lot. This is an excellent place for the overlap of physiological data and the athlete's actual performing power. And if you watch the webinar, I did 3 webinars, The Power of Power Training, it really talks about this in depth. So I'm looking at with this athlete and I see physiological metrics doing well. She needs more power to access that. We just need, now that she's getting healthy, to get after it and do the work. And the type of work, we don't need to keep building capacity. So as I'm looking at the event specificity and how I'm going to manipulate the relationship of volume and intensity, she needs intensity, she needs a lot of it, and she needs it delivered in a way that is going to take advantage of that capacity and build power. Here's the struggle, right? We think about this idea of power and capacity. And we think as we get fit, there's an equal, clean, linear line of growth between the two. The athlete just gets faster, right? The athlete just gets faster. The reality is it looks more like this, or actually you could just flip that around. It would look more like this. It might even look like, lightning bolts going up here. We don't respond to, humans respond to exercise physiology or exercise stimuli in unique ways, right? And that's variable in its own part. So you as the coach have to watch how that's going. And through base training, you can do a pretty good job of that. You can look at the elements of their metabolic fitness. What is their VO2 max? Best indicator of cardiovascular fitness, right? What is their threshold? Best indicator of metabolic fitness. What is their power at VO2 max? The power at, you know what I mean? Gives us understanding of the power. FRC, Pmax. This is where, and basing and looking at the relationship between their actual outputs and their physiological metrics will give you insight. Now, you have to make the decision because you won't have enough time to do both. Commit for one. I look at this athlete I'm talking about and I know she's got all the capacity. It's all in place. So, man, we're just going to bang away. Now we've got 5 weeks to the race season, really kicks off, 4 weeks for her. We have to really just bang away at the power. She's finally probably healthy enough to do it. We need high power training. Capacity will be what it is. It's as big as it's going to get at this stage. We're going a different way. Here's another way to look at it. Caveat. It's like, man, they should take away my ability to do PowerPoint art. This is not a chart. This is a visualization of something I'm about to say. There's no X and Y chart. I put dots on the chart, as you can see, and I made all my own stuff up. But I just want to give a visualization. Green is early base, red is mid base, and yellow is the perform to peak phase. So when I look at it aerobically, because it's both aerobic and anaerobic capacity, you have to separate those two and think about them separately, right? So in aerobic capacity and for aerobic capacity and power and early base, I want to really build aerobic capacity. And as we do so, don't get me wrong, aerobic power will come up naturally. It's just not the focus. I want to build, build, build. As we move into mid phase, right, I am now thinking about more power. We're moving to tempo and sweet spot, right? We're beginning to become more intensive aerobic in our approach towards aerobic training. But as I move into the base period, I'm willing, hopefully it won't, but I'm willing to let this spend down a little in capacity. But the reality is the intensive training of the peak period will still bring up the aerobic power. And you see this in a lot of studies and communication where people talk about like high intensity training and how high intensity training can increase aerobic performance. Let me just stay away from specific terms at a moment. And that's what you're seeing. It still can improve the aerobic power. You just might not quite have the same capacity. All training specificity comes with a cost. You focus over here is going to lose something. Now, the same but dramatically different relationship has to be discussed what happens during the same phases of your anaerobic power. Often after resting, your anaerobic power is very high, right? You're rested, you're stored back up. Your anaerobic power is one of the slowest elements that you lose while you detrain. So you could probably crack out a pretty good 45-second effort off the couch after 4 weeks of resting from last season, right? But as you begin to do all this aerobic capacity work, you start bringing that power down. You're slowly adding a little anaerobic capacity, but you're bringing it down, right? The cost benefit of training and training specificity. And this will lead us into some future discussion, actually. Then we kind of get into that intensive phase, right? And you flatten out, you stop losing, you're going a little harder. You have some elements in the mid phase that level out the loss of power, but you are gaining a little anaerobic capacity. Sweet spot work will build a little anaerobic capacity more so than you even think. And then as you go hard, and hard isn't always hard. I'm going to explain that, I guess, too, in a moment. As you go hard, then you're building back here. Now, a thing here, right, is imagine these two things. It's kind of interesting enough to separate them out as two little blocks, but they lay over each other. The reality of the physiological change, the adaptation that the athlete is going through is these are happening at the same time in that cost-benefit relationship. And the end of the day, it's why it's so important that you have specificity. Decide what kind of a car they're going to be. Decide the specific and general demands or the general and specific demands to make them succeed. What's it going to take to make them go fast? And then manipulate the volume and intensity relationship to output the most power. Is that aerobic power or anaerobic power? In this phase, don't get too caught up in that, except for the decision of what to do, the decision of planning. Remember, this is periodized planning. When it comes down to the implementation, if you take an athlete's threshold from 275 watts to 315 watts in 8 weeks of pushing to peak, right? To be honest with you, you don't give a shit if it's aerobic or anaerobic. You really won't, will you? Nor will your athlete. They just will take the watt. The point that it really matters is for you to look at the whole athlete and make the right determination. Go back to the grid I had on the previous page, right? You're making the right determination of where to focus. And that is in the data analytics. That is determining the relationship between their physiological capabilities and their actual power outputs, which is well explained in the power webinar, the Power Behind Power Training webinar. So hopefully that, and again, don't post this on Facebook and say, well, what's the X and Y? How many watts is that, Tim? It's just a visual display. I see some good questions rolling in. I'm going to get to them in this. So now let's talk about manipulation. So as we get into this idea of manipulating volume and intensity, here's my general rules-based thinking. And when you're implementing a process in training, right, you're using data and analytics to remove bias and to improve the odds of success. The data doesn't tell you what to do. You as the coach or the self-coached athlete, you still have to make the decisions. And I don't care who says it, and I will gladly argue this with anybody. If you are a company saying you have machine learning that can give you good training, You can't. There are too many variables. We don't have enough data. I know that sounds crazy as we collect HRV and power and heart rate and core temperature and all these things. You do not have enough data. You do not have enough control of the variables to run AI or machine learned coaching. And you are 10 to 20 years away from that if it happens. It takes more. So the reality is what I'm saying to you is the analytics, the chart, the power duration curve, the resulting met, no one of those things are the answer of how you're about to manipulate this volume intensity. There's only one answer. It's up here. It's your brain, it's your wisdom, it's your knowledge, it's your understanding of the principles. And it's having a process that allows you to take all that wisdom and knowledge and express it in actual function. I can write my athlete a training plan. So for me, I have certain rules, which I tried to capture here. It's harder than you think, right? Go think your own out and you're going to be like, wow, that really is hard. First off, I want to make sure I'm managing time and intensity distribution. So if you remember in the last webinar, I was talking about cycle 2, 3, and 4. In the first webinar, I was talking about cycle 1, 2, and 3. I'm building, here, I don't want to go back. I'm doing some variable work. And here my goal is to extend time and zone work and do some variations. Here, I'm reducing overall volume and I want increase, like every workout. I want to increase every step. I'm going to, if I've done these steps right, my athlete's prepared to do a lot of work without burning them over. Part of the reason you're going easier here, you're slowly building, is you're not accumulating too much chronic fatigue. You don't want to bring a lot of chronic fatigue into this phase, because once we get going here, I want to spend that. We want to create some fatigue. Short, hard hit pulse, drive that peak, pull back, taper into a peak, win the race. So here, where we're slowly building volume, intensity, all those deals, here we want more power. Here's your Star Trek, right? I need more power, Scotty. This is it. And I'm going to kind of define that in a little bit. Now, the red is not overall time and zone. This is more of a polarized view. I'm going to get into rhythm here in a moment, modality. But just that's 2 to 3 hard days a week. That's the polarized system in general. I manipulate it a little bit, as I'll show you. What am I targeting? I'm not going to get into this. I think Coggin's chart, this chart's out there. He really laid this out pretty well. There's other charts that could give it to you deeper maybe, or your own physiological knowledge. But this is where it gets really hard, right? Because when we get into this heavy phase, there's so much precision. There's so much specificity and specialization. I can't sit here and say, do a lot of SST, raise volume. I can't. All I can do is say you have to do that reanalysis of the athlete. You have to decide what kind of a car they want to be. Once you've got that, you've got to work through those specific demands, make a determination on their capacity, power, standing, commit to all that, and now punch away hard at what they need. This time frame of this manipulation, this peak manipulation at its core, is only 3 to 6 weeks. The second biggest mistake I used to see in training, but I see it self-repairing now, fixing itself, is they do the peak or the heavy build for 12 weeks. I can just do 12 weeks of VO2 max intervals. I'll be really fast. No, you won't. Maybe if you just got off the couch and it was the only work you were doing, or you'd be relatively fast, but no, you won't. The reality is, once you get into an intensive phase of training, most of the gain you will get will occur in the first 3 to 5 weeks. Now, I say 3 to 6 weeks at the core, and I might even say 3 to 8, because you might need an athlete who can only do 2 weeks on, right? And then has to rest some time off, then 2 weeks on. So it might stretch it out a little bit more, the overall load, but that's really the individualization. My core is 3 to 6 weeks, counting on most of the gain to happen in 3 to 5 weeks. If you've done your base training right, you've built the systems in a generally linear fashion, and you have the athlete ready for this phase, they should get most of the peak phase from the intensive work in that 3 to 5 weeks. If you keep going down that path, you might get 1 or 2% faster, but what you're also going to do is you're going to bring about a lot of additional fatigue that's going to do nothing for the athlete come performance time. You're actually going to reduce their ability to perform because, yeah, you've gotten a little load in, and maybe on that absolute perfect day, they can do 4 more watts. But they're so much more fatigued that they're not ready to perform at a high level. This is an intensive approach. You have to have a significant increase in the intensity load because you want to send a very loud adaptive signal and look for a rapid, specific adaptation to induced demands response. If quality work accomplished. I should say if quality work is accomplished, but we'll take that one. And what you're fearing here, right, is garbage in, garbage out. So if you can get your athlete through the base training, and I preach this because it's the only way my brain thinks. I oversimplify everything, even though this doesn't sound oversimplified. My whole entire base period, whether you call that early base, mid, late base, even into build, whatever terminology you're using, I'm just training to train. I want that athlete to arrive at this point with a system of building blocks in place that when they get here, they can smash it. And I want them both mentally and physically ready to smash it, not just physically. If they get into this phase and they're not really ready, and then you overprescribe or you prescribe work they can't really do, that's when you get the bad workout disease, right? I went out to do my VO2 max intervals and 3 in. I just was really struggling. Then a dog ran out in the road, and I picked a bad course, and there was a street light, and they don't do the work. What I actually find is when you do the foundation right and you tell the athlete about this phase, you get them mentally and physically prepared for this phase, and they feel good, they feel their progression. They're the athletes that go out and are like, I found the perfect hill. I nailed this workout. Yeah, I was kind of falling off power that last one, but I would not quit. That's quality work, right? And maybe they fell off 10 watts, but that's still quality work. What you fear is the athlete who doesn't have that confidence, can't execute, wasn't ready, you made the wrong power capacity choice or something like that, and they can't do the work and the garbage starts flowing. As soon as you see garbage in this 3 to 5, because in my system, I'm narrowing it down. I'm putting all my cards in there for an ultimate peak. If you're wrong, you got to pull back, rest a week or so, and then kind of start again you can repeat that approach, but you got to reset the athlete. And the second point was really funny. I have to give Holy Moore and I were talking the other day about another topic about improving pump stroke and volume and whatever, one of those boring conversations we can have at times. And he said it to me, and I was like, man, I couldn't believe he said that, because it was like something that I always believed that he said out of the blue. And then that was like a nice, clean sort of validation that somebody else is not as, or somebody else is as crazy as me, has the same type of belief, right? He said, the reality is, Tim, when I see people do like intensive VO2 max blocks, they don't really respond unless they have a lot of aerobic capacity going in. Yes, couldn't agree more. I don't believe in doing intensive VO2 max or intensive FTP blocks or any intensive build here unless there's certain things in, or the athlete simply won't adapt. The system underneath isn't prepared to handle the stimuli. It isn't. The alarm phase of gas is too much. It overwhelms the body. The adaptive signal in that sense falls on deaf ears. You might be going really hard. You might think you're sending a loud signal, but the signal isn't as loud as you think, and nobody's here home to hear it. So it's so important that when you move to this phase, you have that good foundation. And that's why, and I bet you every coach here has had the argument. The athletes, oh yeah, I want to hire a coach. I'm only 6 weeks out from my big event, and I've been riding on Mondays and Thursdays, but I really want to win that national championship, right? And you're like, oh man, what do I do? Do I take on that athlete? Do I not take on that athlete? I know I have to reset them, or I know they're going to need some foundational work underneath. But then, unfortunately, I see the scenario where the coach takes that athlete, puts them through 5 weeks of intensive VO2 max building, and the athlete still struggles. They suffer for 5 weeks and still fails. Sometimes you just got to know that there's a reality of things that has to happen to make it work. Let's talk about the rule of progression here. So I'm gonna get in trouble for this. Um, you have to, it's the +1 principle. Whatever you've done in today's hard work, tomorrow you're going to do +1. And the day after that, you're going to do +1. And the day after that, you're going to do +1. So we've compacted everything down to this tight little window. We have to push the progression. Now, that's a pace of progression, right? You as a coach have to have the wisdom of what that athlete can manage. So let's say you went out and did a VO2 max workout. And let's just say you prescribed 7 times 3 minutes on with 3 minutes off, just kind of that flat, basic VO2, which is bread and butter, good work, right? If you, the next interval work, so that total time in VO2 max zone, to use that as a term, was 21 minutes of work. And if you're using WKO, obviously, which you all are, you can actually look at the time at VO2 max. And I'm looking at time over 90 or 95%, depending on the ability of the athlete. And that might be 12 minutes or 11 minutes of time above 90% VO2 max. The next workout has to be more. Now, does that mean I should take, what did I say is the example, 6 times 3 and go to 8 times 3 or 9 times 3? No, you have to determine the progression. The athlete might have given you feedback that that exhausts them and they can barely do it. So what if you did 6 times 3:15 for the first 3? I'm sorry. What if you, your 6 times was 3 times 3 minutes and 15 seconds for the first 3 and only 3 minutes for the second 3. So they do the first 3 a little bit longer, right? Well, they had the pep and then do 3 minutes. The overall time goes up by 45 seconds. Maybe you do a fourth one, bring up the overall time by a minute. If you think they can handle 6 more minutes, change them into, 6 times 4 minutes. And you have the reality of event specificity and other things here. I'm giving generalized ideas. But you need to always be progressing at what you believe is the maximal progression rate the athlete can handle in this time window. You've been training them for this time window. You're going to keep this time window short, and you got to push it. Power tracking is the key here. Me in this phase, I'm not even looking at power duration metrics. I got to be honest with you. And I see so much discussion, and this is continuing to evolve in the Facebook group. I'm looking at power, and I'll talk about that in a moment. What's the greatest influence on today's workout? Yesterday's workout. I am constantly looking over my shoulder, meaning I want to know what they did Tuesday, how well they performed, how well they felt, what was their RPE, what was their recovery, how well did they sleep that night? And then I'm writing that next workout. Now that's really hard. I'm writing the general workout, but in advance, I write the plan as advance, but I might tweak that next workout based on what I learned. This is a lot of work. And here's where it's hard for coaching because it's a tough business. Nobody gets paid for coaching. You do it because you love it. You're not becoming millionaires, right? And it's hard to have that much individual view and approach towards workout. But we're talking about, like I said in the first webinar, right? The perfect principle, the perfect world principle. So in the perfect world, that's what it takes, and that's what you need to do. So you're using that information to tweak the next hard workout, or maybe even just the next workout. So when you talk about tracking this, here's a very simple tracking format that's gotten so lost in the world of today. And I'm part of the responsibility. Kevin Williams, the guy who wrote WKO, has really been the brains behind it since it was TrainingPeaks, 500 years ago. He's funny. We were just kind of talking about metrics and this and that and blah, blah, blah. We kind of came back to this. Well, what about the power? And it's like, well, what's a chart? What's the most basic thing? And we started looking at all athletes back in this old school way. WKO3 and WKO2 did this, and TrainingPeaks did this. And all this chart is weekly bests at 5 minutes, 20 minutes. And all we did in WKO5 was use simple linear regression to put a line. Power is the best indicator of success. And part of it is we ourselves with the power duration curve introduced the idea of doing metrics, and metrics are great and they help explain the why. They give us precursors to improvement. They help us understand the specific nature of the response to training. But at the end of the day, you don't win on Pmax. Maybe you do, when you know what I mean. You don't win on FOC, I guess you do, but you win on the actual power you put out. So don't forget that good basic tracking. For me, I go back to this. I've added this back to my list. It was kind of funny based on that conversation. I look at it like this. I have a 2-stage, there's a race readiness report that I have a custom version. To be honest with you, I'm not going to show you everything I actually do, but I'll give you the idea and you can think about it from that. I'm running. So if you think about what this is doing, right, it's showing me peaks at select timeframes, 5 minutes, 20 minutes, 60 minutes. So here I'm running 3 power duration curves compared. I'm running 3 FTPs compared, and I'm running some other data compared, power at VO2 max, some other things, right? What I'm doing though, what I manipulate in my time range, and you could build a chart that just does this, is I have last season minus 30 days, this season minus 30 days, and the last 30 days. So what I'm really looking at is the last 30 days, what I'm training at now, versus the entire season minus these 30 days. So as we get intensive, and for me with my athletes, I'm just moving into this phase with all my athletes. I've got the luxury of coaching all athletes sort of on the same schedule. I have the luxury, but you can see here that this athlete, this is the season. The red is their last 30 days, and the yellow, it's hard to see the colors, and are last season. So they're ahead of last season. This preseason's gone better. But the last 30 days, there's been a little bit of drop off here. That's probably just a testing time range. But if you think about this, as you move over it, you're getting this, but compared very specifically in time. In this race readiness, there's a report. It'll look slightly different because I stack mine. I use overlap and overlap. That shows me cluster. So I want to know, and I know I preach about this a lot, but it's just my brain. It's the way I think. What's the athlete's peak during these time ranges? And then I compare those same 3 time ranges. I just didn't want to make the screen too busy. What's their peak number in this range? What is their peak cluster? And what's the percentage range? How far out is that cluster spread? The tighter the cluster, assuming hard efforts, the tighter the cluster, the more ready the athlete, the more on peak form the athlete is coming. It'll happen every time. If the athlete has hard efforts, if they're not doing hard efforts, that won't really matter that much. Now, what I have a customized version, I could have shared it. I actually put a slope to the cluster and peak, if you think about what you're talking about, and I want to make sure it's trending positively. The cluster itself is getting bigger. The average power of the top 5 efforts is getting bigger, right, as we get closer. During this time frame, it's really important that you individualize intensity. I just saw a pretty good post today about have an athlete doing VO2 max work, have them start out at 105 to 120. Honestly, I want to ask why. Why would you do that? We have better knowledge, better targeting, use better targeting, individualize the targeting, because that is the classic VO2 max zone. Individualize the targeting and use eye levels. But understand there's a fine line between prescription and description. Meaning, for me, with my athletes, I have a unique way of prescribing. And even in that, I'm kind of not saying exactly what I do, I guess. I'll say, look, go out in your first interval and do this number. Here's your target. And I use eye level and the curve or optimized intervals to target that. Then I say in interval 2, pick it up a little from that. And I might have given, just below eye level is interval 1 and just above eye level is interval 2. And I don't use the full range, but maybe the power duration curve, right? 92% of them, or pick some number that you would have. Then I'm like, use that second one. If it feels good and that's the right power, now just keep pushing, see if you can go 1 watt harder for the rest of the intervals. Not 10, not 20, because I don't want them to flame out. This isn't a max set. I do have a max protocol, but I want them to just do that. And I tell them, don't worry about the power number. Don't um, think about it too much. As a matter of fact, what I'll say on that second interval is start at the same spot, and wherever you got to on the second one, just try to go a little further. It's just a different way, right? Old school. We were doing that 25 years ago. But just not thinking about the power. But I want that effort. I want that push. I want them constantly to be pushing forward. So I'm individualizing the first one or two, but I'm not making that the whole prescription. I'm giving them room to interpret. But that room isn't freedom. That's two different things too. I don't just say go bananas and drop 50 extra watts if you can. There's a self-determined process. Optimized intervals. I use optimized intervals heavily in this phase as time guidance. So if I was trying to build VO2 max or max aerobic capability with this athlete, I would see 3 minutes and 46 seconds. I would round that out. I would prescribe, as long as it wasn't counter to our need for specificity here. Like, wow, we've got to work on 6 minutes or you're going to lose. That might override that, but it's pretty rare that that actually occurs like that. And I'll target my intervals at 3 minutes and 45 seconds. It's good, excellent guidance, gives us the greatest point of physiological adaptation. The most important thing you can do in this phase, and actually I have a slide later showing it, is collect and measure your athletes' feelings after every ride. So if they're not noting it in TrainingPeaks, make them note it, make them note it, make them note it. You as the coach need the subjective data to make determinations about ongoing intensity prescriptions. If the athlete is like, I did that one workout and I barely survived and I died and the RPE was 10 and I didn't recover and I couldn't sleep, and then they go out the next Thursday and repeat it with a little more and it's even worse, you got to rethink where your progression is. If the athlete does one like, man, that was pretty easy, whatever, you got to rethink where your progression is. But you need that feedback from the athlete. And I'll show you a chart on this in a minute. Modality, I'm going to keep this pretty simple because I think it's been pretty beat to death. Different training modalities. To me, I'm going polarized. So a fair amount of easy, right? Easy days are easy, hard days are hard. 80, 20, 70, 30. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. One exception though, for longer events, I do not polarize. You know, in today's world, there's so many ultras and gravel races and long-term things. I do not polarize in those. So in that sense, it's not like, wow, I want to do a whole bunch of intensity work. They're going out to do a 200-mile gravel race. One of our coaches was just asking me about one of their athletes is doing a 200-mile gravel race. The specificity is volume. And when that occurs, you're better off remaining or enhancing the pyramidal approach more times in zone 1 and zone 2, because the reality is that's the specific demand of the event. They need to have that volume. They need that high threshold. They need to be able to have muscular endurance and stamina. They need to practice fueling over long and burn more fats and all that stuff. So I'll polarize in general, but longer events will go pyramid. Polarizing looks like this intensity schedule. I just showed you that earlier. So that's, you know, same setup, 2 to 3 hard days a week. I track it more by eye levels, but I still am looking at the idea of these being polarized. I simply use the monthly or weekly time in cog and eye levels, and I'm just tracking it in a color stack like that. When you think about the polarized schedule and how it plays out on the week, I'm doing a hard day Tuesday, a hard day Thursday. Sometimes I'm backing off on this Thursday. That's like, I might not do as many intervals on Thursday if the athlete's struggling with the fatigue, because here they're fresher. If their Monday was off, and you could easily, you know, move these around. Again, you present things in a neat little week, you know, but you can move it around as you see fit. And then a hard day on Saturday and longer day on Wednesday and longer day on Sunday. I still like the idea of having a long, long day on Sunday if you can keep that during this phase and it doesn't create too much fatigue. It's the first thing I'll give up if the athlete's really fatigued. But if you can just get a good, casual, longer ride, you'll do a great job of maintaining aerobic capacity. 1 day a week, the booster, so to speak, can really help you maintain. Even if you get to that every other week, it can really help you maintain that aerobic capacity. When it comes to interval modality, there's a lot. And I didn't go into workouts. It's like, yes, we could do workout examples. You could do VO2 max intervals and all these intervals in different ways. But I actually did an in-depth WKO5 webinar on building intervals, which talk about like literally that's a slide from it. I'll put the link in the presentation. You can track it down and watch that full webinar. Talking about managing your fitness and freshness. First off, I'm tracking the athlete's response, right? Subjective feelings. HRV is not subjective, but I track it in my subjective group. Your sleep, your stress and motivation, your sickness, injury, your RPE. I'm looking at that every day now. As a matter of fact, it's the first thing I look at. I want to know what my athlete feels. Then I go look at the data. Because I want to know if they can sustain, man, if we just get them through, just hang on this 5 weeks, punch, 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 right? It's going to be worth it. Why? Because the workout goal is quality, not just tolerating. I just got through it. I want the athlete to absorb it. I want them want more. You know, we've been there with our athletes like, well, that felt it, that crushed me. And they're not sure they want more, but they think they want more, right? That's the perfect balance. You've worked them hard enough to take some of the edge off, but yet they're like, I think I want more. If they're just tolerating the workouts, it's probably your starting intensity. There was a little too much work early in the mix. You're better off, by the way, if you're not sure how much intensity to start with, start a little lower and work your way up. You can always add a couple of days of workouts to get to where you want. But if you start too hard, that's like, by hard I mean too much time at intensity. That's when you get in trouble. Hope that made sense. I think about it as a performance management relationship, and I will, during this phase, we reduce volume, and we reduce volume to the point we build down a little bit of CTL. So here you see a race season, a professional athlete trying to race in the season, very stagnant throughout the summer. They drop off, rest period. Here's your base and build, nice blocks, right? But now it's race season again. As soon as we go into peak mode, right, we see this drop off here. The athlete has a couple of peak events in here. Nice clean builds. But if you notice, two things are happening. We're beyond the CTL peak. I'm not really measuring CTL. I'm much more focused on ATL in this phase. CTL is just a result. I don't ignore it either, but it's not a driver. And I actually look at ATL limits during this phase. And that's like if you have an athlete that's racing a lot, that's an excellent habit to build. You know, it's kind of funny. I joke with my athletes, like sometimes we have to give ATL a haircut. You come in here with the clippers like, oh, this is just too much. And we slow it all down, right? I don't want them at any given time to accumulate too much ATL. Or a better way to say it is I want to appropriately manage their TSB or their training readiness. So I actually use the training readiness. I have a custom one, to be honest with you, that have some indicators and some things built in for me. You can customize yours. And if you see here in the build, we are doing some high volume, right? In these early phases, you see it here, both years, there is some higher, and this is 2020, which we all know for all of our athletes looked a little wacky. So, you know, we build. You see those heavier, those low TSB days, right? The athlete's got high ATL, you know that's going to be the inverse. But then when they get into the peaking period, we don't see those deep dives much, right? We want to be here in the green, a little bit here. This is like a little stage race in a strange time of year. Not strange, but early stage race, let's just call it. Then they come back, same thing next year, but then COVID hits, doesn't look quite like it should. But then turns out there is some racing in Europe, so a really fast build. And then as we go to peak for that time frame, we immediately move back into not so much ATL or the appropriately balanced TSB. Probably could have explained the connection between ATL and TSB. They're basically the inverse of each other, offset by one day. I tend to think about it more as the acute training load creating fatigue, or versus training stress balance. But you can ask me questions on that in the Q&A. Finally, power is the greatest predictor of performance. You know, in all of this, to me, what we're looking at as we're thinking about what's happening here is I'm tracking. People ask me all the time, like, what's your key thing for an athlete to come on peak form? I'm looking at the cluster analysis I showed you. And I've showed it in a couple of things. I look at other things, that's fair enough. But I also have a unique scenario. I work with all professional athletes at the moment. And they're riding hard right now, meaning they're going to team camps, they're base training, and that leads to team camps, and that leads to harder riding right off the get-go. Then they're into a fair amount of early racing. So it's a little cleaner and easier for me to say that, and I get it, but I don't have a better way of answering it. Except this, maybe here's a good answer. My next slide is Q&A, so fire them up. When I think, and it was funny, I was sitting talking to my wife, Kathy, who's also an awesome coach and might actually be on the session. And we were just talking about, like, what does it really take? Like, what's the key thing you're measuring? To me, right, you use all of this data to make good decisions. You use all those good decisions to implement a process. The entire goal of your process is to increase the odds of success. That's what you're playing for. So at the end of the day, there's a certain amount of me, which I didn't realize till I started really thinking about these 3 steps and 4.5 hours of webinars, kind of articulate your process, that the process as a coach is as important as the measuring metrics. Meaning, one of the things that I think has been a benefit for me over years of doing this and working with such a broad array of athletes is I've honed a process that works as the banks of my river. I use data in that process to help me make superior decisions. And by superior, I mean higher chance of success, better odds of being right? And hopefully that leads to increased outcomes. So in closing and moving into Q&A, and I'll take them and anybody can stay on as long as it takes. Don't forget, one of the things I would like everyone to take away from these 3-point series is develop your process, do this, write yours out, take the time to write it out, build some of your grids like I did. I just find when you try to take the things that you have in your mind and write them out and say, this is my process, it's very powerful for coaches. Because as soon as you see it, you're going to refine it. As soon as you see it and refine it, you'll probably refine it again. And then you'll test it and you'll think about how it applies to you implementing with your athletes. And then you'll improve it. And that's what training is by nature, right? That's you going through general adaptation syndrome. You write out your process, right? That creates new stimuli. Wow, the body's in alarm. Cool, I just made X's and O's. I have a process. Then you learn and you think and you begin to work and adapt to that process and you're improving it, right? You're resisting all the problems. I can improve this, I can improve this. So I would really encourage you to think about that. All right, I'm gonna drink water and take questions because I let them build up, but here we go. And you guys don't have to stay on for Q&A, it'll be recorded. I'll answer any general question you have. All right, I'm gonna put the questions over here on this screen though, so I don't have to keep turning my head. Hi, Tim. Most Cat 1-2 athletes wish to race for as much of the season as they can. Training plans and software are generally great based to build peak for one-off races, but difficulty is managing competitiveness for longer durations, perhaps 6 to 8 or 4 to 6 months. For example, athletes like to race national races every weekend. Any tips on how best to manage this in terms of targets for ratios and time and zone balance? Here's a great tip for you. First off, get clarity with your athlete. So when I have an athlete who does that, and it happens all the time, right? When you, because at a professional level, obviously the seasons are extremely long, right? And you've got so many races. You've got to convince the athlete, you at best, if you train everything right, you're going to have 2 peaks a year, 2 true peaks. Now, don't get me wrong. You can have kind of a perma peak, which isn't quite as high as that, but you can hold it all summer long and race like this. It might be 5% less or 3% less or 7%, but it won't be your true and absolute peak. And I think you have to have that discussion with your athlete first. And if they are like, I so want to win nationals, or I so want to win that one state championship, then you build this type of format, and training is in racing. You race as part of the training. You have to fit that within your schedule and rhythm, but you don't taper them. You race them like it was hard training days, and they have to be, their ego has to be ready to do that. And that's probably one of the key differences between pros and non-pros. When you say that to a professional cyclist, they're like, of course, I'm going to do those 10 races like they were training races. And those other 2 that happen, back-to-back weekends, those I want to win. Because eventually over time, they just realize that you can't have both. That is where I would start. Now, if the athlete comes back and says, I just want to be fit and race well all year, which is cool, right? That's what I would probably do. I don't know. Wouldn't have any big goals, right? I just want to be fast and run the same process, bring them to the beginning of the season on peak, rest them so don't change the process. Just bring them, talk them into resting somewhere in the middle, 8 to 10 weeks in, 6 to 8, maybe. It depends on how that season actually plays out. Do a quick little aerobic build, a couple of weeks, punch maybe a really short 2 weeks of peak work, which you can use racing for, get them back into racing, and then bang away at it again. All training is cost benefit. If they want to be perma-fit, the peak will not be as high. How do you measure capacity? Historical data? Yeah, Chris, that's a great way. So I have some capacity tests. So you can think about capacity, how long they can sustain a time at power, a form of time to exhaustion, which is a little bit of a hint. Also, there are some repeatability tests. So I might go out and I have a repeatability test protocol I do with my athletes that I use as a measurement for repeatability, because that's part of or a form of capacity. So yeah, I usually use history and a combination of testing and metrics to determine it. But that's the art of it, right? That's why it's so hard, you guys. It's not like I can say, man, here's the hard and fast rule, because when the athlete moves into this peak phase, right, it is way different between if you're doing a 12-hour gravel grinder, a 45-minute crit, a 90-minute cross-country mountain bike race, or a 30-minute time trial. So the number of examples I would need to give you are staggering and way beyond me mentally. You think these webinars are long? Ask for that. So I try to use that type of information and make determination. Chris, I test it at the end. I have a test workout or two at the end that I make some determinations on capacity. We can actually talk about that in other groups. Hey, David, is capacity and power related to MFTP as a percentage? Not really. When I use MFTP as a percentage, what I'm really comparing there, even though it's all related, right? It's all in the same system. Think about it this way. VO2 max is the greatest indicator of your cardiovascular fitness. It's telling you how much intake and uptake oxygen is working within the system, stroke volume, O2 uptake, all the things that you need in that system. FTP is your metabolic fitness. How are you dealing with the utilization of fuel? How are you producing that energy? And how are you dealing with byproduct? So if you think about metabolic fitness, right, how much fuel can you get into the system and how much byproduct can you get out? It's one of the reasons I like the engine analogy. You need both. You need more fuel in and more fuel out. And of course, the engine needs to be efficient, but that's what you're training. So that's different. Something different, but that does tell me and help me train, make decisions about training modality in the mid-base periods. Are you defining aerobic capacity as endurance or VO2 max, or VO2 max and aerobic power? That's a great question, because I went back and I said aerobic power and anaerobic power. For me, when I look at aerobic capacity, it's a broad range, but I'll always hone it down by specifically what the athlete wants. So overarching, you're talking about the size of the aerobic engine and driven by how it fuels, how efficient it is, and this and that. But reality is, when we're talking about aerobic capacity, I want to know the highest powers output at certain aerobic markers. So let's call it an oversimplification here, but let's call it LT1 and LT2. A lot of what I'm looking for in early aerobic capacity is I want to push LT1 as close to LT2 as possible. When we start talking later on, I might broaden that a little bit in how I define it. And repeatability and some things like that come into it. Really hard question to answer without a really 1-hour webinar. But I think that was some hints. You could ask it again if it wasn't. When is it time to move from sweet spot to FTP work? It depends. It really depends. They can, by the way, they go together really well. So here's an example, right? I'll give you a very simple example based on the last question. if your athlete has been doing a fair amount of work and they're really good at aerobic capacity and they're doing a lot of sweet spot, and that's helping their aerobic capacity, it will also help their anaerobic capacity a little bit too, right? But now they can go out and do, how many people here use Zwift, right? And you go out and you do a long Saturday morning 100-kilometer fast group ride in Zwift. And the athlete goes out and their threshold might be 4.0 watts per kilogram, and they do 3.6 watts per kilogram for 2.5 hours. Zwift is bringing that about, right? Zwift's doing a lot of that longer steady state stuff, which is pushing LT towards LT1, or it's really improving the length of time you can sustain sweet spot because it's making sweet spot more and more aerobic. So it's kind of like it's improving your aerobic capacity. So the reality is, if that aerobic capacity is that high that you can go out and do that, it might better help you to flip to a more power-based approach. Capacity is full. If you can hold 2.5 hours of sweet spot, or low sweet spot, which I see people do on Zwift, and can do it 2 hours of sweet spot or more in intervals. Pros can. It's time to develop some power. Your capacity is probably pretty high, so I might flip to FTP work then. It's a gut feel. It's an art. It's really, the data helps, but you just got to know when the athlete's got diminishing returns, their threshold isn't moving anymore. That's a good way to look at it. Physiological stagnation. How do you know when the athlete has a good basic engine to go into VO2 max block? It's really hard. Jenko, you're asking the questions exactly what I'm talking about, that it takes learning and experience and stuff over time. I would say when the athlete stagnates, so let's say you just start riding your bike a lot and you're tracking MFTP or FTP or set FTP, right? And FTP, or 60-minute power, FTP is improving every month, every 3 weeks. And it's going up in some reasonably linear format. And then suddenly, right, that's as high as it goes. Then you do a little other work, and it goes a little higher, but it really doesn't move like it was moving. That's a good indicator. Now, when you look at physiological metrics, you usually see that, but not always. Here's the problem. You usually see that when threshold starts becoming a higher percentage of VO2 max. It's usually getting close to that 85%. That's telling you that you've increased the threshold as much as you can, as much as you have room for, and it's time to do some more work. Now, that won't be a nice, clean equation if you just jump off the couch and you're training 4 hours a week. It's, it's only going to be reflective of the work you're doing. You might, at 4 hours a week, you might be training hard for you, but you might only be 75%. And maybe a VO2, so there's too many variables to answer the question. Besides what I just did. I feel bad ducking questions like that, but if I answer it with one answer, you have to give me all the athletes' data and I'll answer it. But you can't make generalizations like that without creating risk. When is it more appropriate to use eye levels versus optimized intervals? Dave, I use eye levels when the time range doesn't match the optimized intervals. So I've had the situation a couple of different times where there is some specific event or course demand that's like, man, that athlete has to have 2-minute power. Or man, that athlete has to have 9-minute power, right? And the optimized interval doesn't line up well. Even though I know it will improve the physiological system a little better, targeting off the eye level will better prepare them for the specific demands of the event. So when the gap is big, let's say it's that the athlete needs 8-minute power, and the eye level saying and the optimized interval for VO2 max is saying do 3-minute intervals. Yes, the 3-minute interval might raise their VO2 max, the physiological driver of improvement in that time range. But the reality is the specific power at 8 minutes will be better if I target 8 minutes. Hopefully that made sense. But that's an analysis you have to do as a coach. So if the athlete needed 5-minute power and the optimized interval was 4 minutes, I would do the optimized time frame because I believe I'd rather focus there on the system and raise the VO2 max, the maximum aerobic power in general better. But when the specific demand is far away from the optimized, I'll use the eye level. Otherwise than that, I just use optimized intervals throughout this core period, assuming the athlete's testing and has got a good model. To maintain form mid-race season, we reduce volume intensity. How do we avoid day training? I have a particular system, FRC, FTP. Examples, what is the minimum amount of work required to maintain fitness of the systems? Ben, that's next to impossible. The minimum amount of work required really relates to training maturity, the life of that athlete, how stressful, how non-stressful, other things. It's too many variables to answer that question. That being said, it's less intensity than you would think. Once, here you can remember this quote, right? A pretty smart coach taught me this, Dean Golish taught me this. What it takes to get there is not what it takes to stay there. So it's not as much as you think, but it really is based on a lot of other factors that's hard. And that's why, that's why I would test through. One of the things that's funny is testing throughout this kind of, I want to maintain form all summer long. People will say, well, I've done some racing, that's good enough. Maybe, right? I'm always paying attention to the normalized residuals. And if there's a big gap in there, I'm going to ask the athlete to test that because I really want to know if they're detraining. Okay, you're welcome. Maybe the wrong episode, but what would you best guess to be the least amount of aerobic base early to have increases? Being a rider who works and doesn't race, but keep fit and increase over time. Yeah, definitely watch part 1. I answered that question in depth. In reality, but I'll give you a really simple answer. There's only one way to find out. Build a simple progressive schedule and ride it and see if you respond. Test before, test after, and you'll know. Doesn't take too much. Depends on your training history. Regarding VO2 max build phase. Now, I'm not saying build VO2 max in this phase. If a crit rider might be better off working on really short stuff. I just used VO2 max as an example. But regarding VO2 max build phase, an athlete is solidly progressing through their FTP, FRC max aerobic interval sessions over successive weeks. What indicates they have reached their VO2 max peak towards the end of the plan box? All right, good question. Let me just take that part first. If the athlete is consistently achieving 15 to 18 minutes of time above 95% of VO2 max in these workouts, then you're probably at a point of diminished returns. From a physiological sense, it's been studied pretty well that time range is about the maximum amount of load, 15 to 18 minutes at or very near your VO2 max or at your VO2 max. That's about the maximum amount of load that the body's going to adapt to. Anything over that is more than you need. If you've gotten to that point and the athlete's absorbing that time in, time out, that tells me they have really good capacity at maximum aerobic power. But, and it's important you understand what I'm about to say, but they don't have the real power to go harder. So I coach a good time trialist, and she has to do a fair amount of hard work before she can even do VO2 max because her system's so big, right? She has tremendous capacity, but she doesn't have a lot of fast twitch muscle. So we actually have to build a little fast twitch muscle before we can do really good VO2 max work because she can't tap into it hard enough until she starts getting that muscular work. So my answer to your question was if they could do that, I would focus more on power. So I might drop off, and this goes back to Dave's question, I might drop off the max aerobic targeting, shorten it and do more power. I might move up to FRC style approach, right? I would change the prescription at that point because the athlete's already adapted to the load. If they can do that work, they've already adapted to the load. If they can do that work and be like, wow, I felt good for 2 workouts in a row. They get to 15 to 8 minutes from VO2 max. Consider moving on. Don't get stuck stagnating. We overthink and time is going by. Push it, push it. Yeah, and you could use the max principle if you've seen my other stuff. So hopefully that was a good enough answer. At an athlete level, do you somehow track percentage of VO2 max over the peak period? I do look at it, and it's in some charts. There's a couple of charts. I thought it might have been it was in session 2. You'll see the little purple charts that I use. So I am looking at time at VO2 max. We underutilize VO2 max, power at VO2 max, targeting or not targeting, but describing or reviewing against power at VO2 max. It's a powerful tool. So I do track it and pay attention to it. You're welcome. You're welcome. Oh, I see what your question is. Well, is there an easy way to track that total time? Sort of, because we don't know if it's consecutive time. It's always the killer in data. Power training data is too noisy. So we don't know if it's, time in consecutive zone. So I look at it as workout by workout and I record it in the notes. The best I can do. And I tag those workouts so I can find them easily. Sorry, I wish I had a better answer. Kevin and I have thought about it a million times. But there just is no, even if you look at William Renfro's attempts, he picks up a lot of noise because it doesn't know interval within an interval and continuous effort as well. All right, I think I've got, oh no, wait, more coming. Okay. Yes, tracking VI is a good way to look at one of the elements of workouts. Excellent. All right, I think I've gotten to all the questions. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'll get this posted up in the recorded version, and I will link my presentation to it. Thanks again. Have a great day.